In the 16th and 17th centuries, as the age of discovery, as it is sometimes called, matured, the ships that traversed the Atlantic, using sinew to pull sails rather than oars, found that there were times when the wind that powered their vessels would calm, not just for hours or days, but sometimes for weeks, leaving the crews desperate and fearful of being stranded and running out of food and fresh water. In time, as navigators began to keep track and share records of their experiences, it was recognized that these events were not random, but instead happened at specific latitudes and longitudes along the journeys. Soon these regions were given names, sometimes called the horse latitudes, and in other places, the Doldrums. The former name coming from the fact that Spanish ships would, when becalmed, throw horses they were transporting to the New World overboard in an effort to conserve the dwindling supplies. Other ships, following the established shipping lanes, would later come across the carcasses of these poor creatures, which would tell them of the potential fate that awaited their crews. In our language today, the term, being in the doldrums, refers not to a region of the ocean, but rather a state of being, or an emotion where one is listless and not making progress. Again, that term also a reference back to the case when a ship that was not moving would be completely upright, rather than listing a bit, as would be the case when it was pushed by a strong wind. These regions, these dead zones as they were, are created by confluence of global wind patterns, especially near either 30 degrees latitude or at the equator, and what meteorologists call seasonal synoptic systems, such as the Bermuda High, that work together to create slowly sinking air that does not have a consistent or strong pattern of flow and which does not produce clouds. It is one of nature's great ironies that it is actually unstable weather systems that create storms that also produce the winds that made sail-powered ocean voyages possible. Without the advancing fronts between moving air masses, by the way, that meteorological terminology springs from advances made in the discipline during the First World War in order to understand large-scale causes of local weather. Without these motions or winds due to the storms, a ship would be unable to move towards any shore. And such is the case in our voyage of discovery. Over the last year to a degree, and very much more so recently, the Odyssey has made little progress as the winds of inspiration have calmed, leaving the navigator with little to show for his efforts and intentions. This perhaps has left the crew a bit anxious and wondering if the voyage has ended, an understandable outcome given the lack of any new vistas of late. But as is the case with many experienced sailors, the navigator has seen the signs on the horizon that the weather is changing and the winds are beginning to pick up. The voyage will continue. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Season 4, Science and Certainty. Episode 4, Out of the Doldrums. It's been just over 2 months since I've had a chance to sit in front of this microphone and talk with you about science, history, and philosophy. There are a lot of different reasons for that, but I think it really comes down to just a few basic things. First, there's the reality of burnout and/or writer's block. I think that by the end of our season on Finding Our Place, I was really running on fumes. Between trying to wrestle with some really abstract ideas in order to make them understandable and the really long Einstein biography series, I managed to exhaust most of the creativity I was using to generate quality content. While I was able to harness some previously worked on material to produce those 3 episodes on the problem of induction, it was a huge effort to put the words into a script. With the needed research for the episodes I plan on doing for William Whewell, things have just sort of ground to a snail's pace. We are, to use that nautical term from the introduction, in the doldrums. Second, with the beginning of the new semester 3 months ago, and the ongoing demands that have come with that, some of which have been above and beyond what I've been used to for the last few years, there was little chance to catch my breath and recover some of that energy. At my institution, we're undergoing some change at the school, and while much of that change is positive, dealing with that change is something that really can take a lot of energy. That's something that's probably always true for change. Additionally, it's hard to describe the amount of energy that goes into teaching to those who have never done it, but suffice it to say that when I get home at the end of each day, these 2 factors make it hard to sequester myself to research and write the way I have in the past. Third, I have to admit to being uninspired by my material of late. It's not like I plan to just go through the motions, but I really feel like some of what I'm producing, at least over the recent several episodes, has been, how do I say it, a bit flat. When I think back to some of the episodes I did earlier in Season 3 and how they worked to take us to places that were hidden and deeply meaningful, sort of sequestered inlets and coves that were revealed only when I was daring enough to navigate into them, I have a sense that lately I've settled into a familiar pattern that sounds too much like an academic lecture and not enough like the engaging narrative I strive to bring you in each episode. It's not enough to just give you a bunch of information, whether that information be scientific, historic, philosophic, or, if I ever get this Whewell episode finished, biographic. It needs to engage you, the listener, and that means I need to try and do a better job. Doing what I've always done leads to boredom and stagnation. I need to try different things and take a few more risks. I need to stop showing you something on a map and instead take you there. And this isn't to say that I haven't been trying to get some writing done. I've got about 2,500 words done on the aforementioned episode on William Whewell, and I've written almost a complete episode to begin our next season, well, at least in my mind. The problem is that every time I sit down to craft a story that I think will bring these subjects to life, the words seem to slip away, like water through my cupped hands. There for a moment, cool and refreshing, but leaking away and becoming lukewarm, even as I try to get them down into coherent form. As you can imagine, it's been frustrating. But to be honest, it's not just that I have writer's block. Truth be told, I haven't been devoted as much as I should be. I've read in any number of contexts that the craft of writing takes dedication and perseverance, not just on the good days, but on the really bad ones as well. You've got to be willing to sit down and write every single day, even if what you're producing is flat or boring or uninspired or just bad. And I can tell that's what I produce here lately, at least when I do sit down and write. But what I've done is I've allowed myself to get discouraged, and so instead of doing the hard thing of sitting with my work and pushing through those difficult points, I found excuses to do a lot of other things. For that, I apologize. It's one thing to create work that isn't up to a standard. It's something else entirely not to put your shoulder to the wheel at all. I'm going to try and do better because you all, the crew of the Scientific Odyssey, deserve better. The genesis of this soul-searching and mea culpaing, if such a thing can be said, really lies in two events. Over the last few weeks, I've had a chance to listen to two of my podcasting heroes, Mike Duncan and Dan Carlin, talk about their work actually in person. As I've said before, and many of you know, their work and words inspire me, and hearing them talk about both the importance of presenting ideas that are outside the mainstream narrative in general, and the role of podcasting in resetting a conversation that has been generally oversimplified or poorly represented, really hit a nerve with me. The other catalyst has been attending the first annual Sound Education Conference at Harvard, organized by the Ministry of Ideas and Harvard's Divinity School. Over the course of 2 days recently, I got to hear many of my colleagues discuss how they practice the craft of podcasting and what they're able to do to make a difference. As is so often the case in these kinds of things, this sharing of ideas has sparked new energy and enthusiasm, as well as nucleated some new ideas for how to proceed forward. For me, the thoughts of James Landis of the Holy Orders podcast, Brad Harris of Context, and Barry Lamb of the Hi-Fi podcast have helped me think outside of the familiar frameworks I've been using here on this show of late. The best encouragement I received, however, was at the closing keynote, given by the noted journalist and digital media creator, Julika Lentiga Williams, who challenged the attendees, your navigator included, to be significantly more intentional in their approach to podcasting. In light of her presentation, I've considered her questions, and I'd like to share them as well as my answers with you, as I think it's important for reasons I'll make clear here in a few moments. Her first question was, why are we podcasting? Or, to bring this much closer, why am I doing this podcast? While I do some things to answer that question, at least to some degree, in episode 0 setting out, over the course of the last 4 years, I've realized that it's actually much more personal than what I talk about there. I produced this podcast because I want to provide a place for those who are curious about the world around them to have a community to come to be a part of a crew that seeks to view and understand the world around them through the lens of scientific inquiry. But not just pure scientific inquiry. There are a lot of podcasts which discuss recent or cutting-edge scientific research in powerful and engaging ways. I want this community to be something more than, or perhaps different than that. I want this podcast to be a place where our community can consider not just the scientific ideas, but the historical and philosophical contexts of those ideas, as well as the people who have, throughout the centuries, made it their life's work to ask questions and then seek the answers to them. I want to share the fullness of human inquiry and flourishing with those who seek a wider angle to the picture they frame in order to understand the process and practice as it has evolved over the millennia of human investigation. But beyond that, I want to make something that would have captivated me when I was 13 years old and realizing that there was this thirst and passion to understand scientific ideas in that context. I've mentioned before that perhaps the most influential public figure in my life was Carl Sagan and his show Cosmos. While Dr. Sagan wasn't perfect, and the history of science on Cosmos was, at times, flawed and inaccurate, I didn't know any of that then. What I knew was that I wanted to be part of the picture he was presenting that showed the broad sweep of scientific inquiry, and now I realize I want this show to be that for that kind of person. Now, maybe there are some of you out there who listen to the show who are in middle school and who find the material and the stories compelling. I sure hope there are. But what I also know is that there are a lot of you who are older, from graduate students working in your disciplines to educators teaching the next generation of scientists, historians, and philosophers. From inquisitive and curious managers and financial advisors to those who work in solitary jobs that give you a lot of time to think and consider. I want to produce this show for you. I want to create a crew who are willing to sail with me into uncharted waters and do the hard work of pulling lines and keeping watch in order to chart the wide dark sea. I want to be your navigator as we explore together. As some of you know, I think I learned at least as much doing the research for this show as some of you say you do when listening to it. And so, I want this podcast to be a vessel through which we can flourish together. The second question our closing speaker asked us to consider was, who was our audience? She told the story of finding a picture that encapsulated the listener she wanted to produce her show for. And so as she spoke, I tried to picture who it was I was trying to reach. Who was it that I wanted to invite to be a part of the crew of the Odyssey? And as I've considered that idea, what I've realized is there just isn't one picture. Instead, it's a genre of pictures. When I started this podcast, I didn't exactly have this metaphor of a sailing ship on a grand voyage of encounter and discovery right off the bat. It was suggested to me by my colleague in our English department, Dr. Wesley Venus, who thought that perhaps I could tell a few of the stories in the same form as Homer's Odyssey, starting in the middle and then working from there. And while I have done that from time to time, what really caught my imagination more powerfully in that conversation was that metaphor of a crew on a journey always towards the horizon, an image I used explicitly early in Season 3 of this podcast. In every culture, there is that image of the explorer, the pioneer, the adventurer, the one that looks to the horizon and wants to know what is beyond it. That's the picture I have in my head, and that represents the audience I want to reach. I want to move beyond entertainment and write and produce for those who thirst to learn. I want crew members who seek to know more about the human experience of wanting to know more about the universe in which they lived, both by hearing the stories of those who came before and the stories of those who are actively interested in doing so themselves, today and tomorrow. I'm not so concerned that someone be experienced in doing scientific inquiry as much as I am in their wanting to go beyond cocktail party factoids and old dichotomies like science versus religion in order to discover and consider ideas they had not encountered before. To steal a phrase, my intended audience are those who wish to boldly go. The third question Mrs. Latunga Williams asked us was to consider, what was it, how would it be that we would measure success for our podcast? She suggested, quite rightly I believe, that we can't use that traditional member so many seem to fixate on, things like numbers of downloads or numbers of subscribers. These numbers are, at best, indirect indicators of success, and in many cases, they may actually be profoundly misleading given a show's goals. I have, for some time, come to understand that to be the case with this endeavor. As you all know, we dive deeply here, and it can be a lot of work to wade through the scientific information presented, especially when we get into the realm of the 20th century where theoretical models become increasingly more abstract, mathematical, and at times untethered from our direct experience with the world. Moreover, the niche nature of this material, that intersection between science, history, and philosophy, may not appeal to a wide audience anyway, though, to be honest, if the 2 seasons of Cosmos are any indication, perhaps that may not be entirely the case. One of the things that Dan Carlin talked about in his conversation with the conference's organizer, Zachary Davis, was that we podcasters have this grand white space we can paint and play with. The traditional or popular forms of media narrative and storytelling don't really have to apply to us here in podcast land, or as, our speaker said, Podlandia. The conversation and discussion can rise up out of our present shrill set of hot takes and oversimplified tropes and memes if that's what we want, and so we don't have to measure success in the same old ways that come from that same old set of media narratives. So how would I like to measure success? For me, it comes down to community, this thing that I keep bringing up. I think this show is successful if it builds that community, that crew I've been talking about. The podcast is successful if it creates a space for those who want to know the long arc of human scientific knowledge. The hard thing, however, is to measure that in some tangible fashion. The problem with the numbers things is that, for example, I don't know if I'm navigating a ship with 1,500 crew members, most of whom are sleeping below decks, or if that crew is topside, taking measurements, working the rigging, and sighting coastlines and stars as we map our way through the material. as you might imagine, it's a whole lot more interesting for the navigator if the latter is the case. Another thing that's a part of all this has to do with what I guess I think of as an inherent imbalance in the relationship we have as a podcaster and you as a listener. This was brought home to me at the Mike Duncan book signing I attended. I've listened to Mike's work for about a decade, every single episode of material he's ever produced, as well as the book on Roman history titled The Storm Before the Storm. I've told more people than I can count about him. He's been with me on long bike rides and boring drives, while I've worked in my yard, cooked my meals, and done my laundry. He's opened up new vistas, not just about ancient history, but about times and areas I've neglected in my education and reading. Other than my wife and maybe a few close friends, he's been a more constant part of my life than probably any other human being on the planet for that last decade. His work has captured my curiosity, engaged my intellect, and actually even moved me emotionally. To be honest, it's a surprisingly intimate thing. And for those of you who listen to a lot of podcasts, especially those from a single host, I'm pretty sure you know exactly what I mean. And so, when I went to the book signing, as I stood in line, I found myself thinking I was about to meet an old friend. Except, well, I wasn't. Mike Duncan didn't know me from Adam. I'm just one of tens of thousands of listeners he has all over the world, and I'm sure I was just another signature and kind pose for a photograph, which, by the way, I'm never deleting from my phone. This weekend, it occurred to me that this may well be true for the relationship between most of you and I as well. While I've had the honor to get to know a few of you, either through a meetup or two or via social media or email, that's not the case for more than about a dozen or so of the members of the crew. Another aspect of that imbalance is that many of you have been through some of my journeys over the last few years. From getting started and learning this podcasting thing from scratch and having to sort of find my own voice, to going on sabbatical at Berry College, to getting run over by that semi-truck. If you follow me on social media, you know that I've had 2 dogs pass away here recently, and that I've had both failure and success lately in my bike racing ventures. I, on the other hand, know very little about most of you. And I think I kind of want that to change. I want us to be more of a visible group to each other kind of community. And before you go, oh goodness, no, I'm not going there, I want you to hear me out. One of the sessions I attended at Sound Education was a panel discussion moderated by Heather, or Raven Heather, of the Tiny Vampires podcast. She shared that her show is entirely driven by questions from her listeners. While I'm not sure that would work with what we're doing here, I really envied her level of engagement with her listeners. It was one of the things that makes her show successful, I think. And it's also something I thought that Craig Buddy did really well with his History of Pirates podcast. So what I want to try to do is create some community building opportunities in the same spirit as our Summer Odyssey project. Now, since many of you will hear this episodes weeks or even months after I've recorded it, it doesn't make sense to do things that are super time sensitive, at least not all the time. So here's what I'd like to ask you to do. If you haven't already done so, and I know a number of you have, go out and join our Facebook page. Or if you don't do Facebook, which I certainly understand, follow me on Twitter or Instagram. I am out there at Instagram. I'm Flechette15. Once you do that, introduce yourself and let us know why you're a member of the crew. That's all you have to do. You don't have to tell us about your personal life or politics or religious affiliation or anything like that, unless that sort of thing is relevant to what you're going to talk about as to why you're a member of the crew and you feel like it. If you're a scientist, let us know what you're working on. I know everyone would love to hear that. And if you're not, well, tell us what scientific or historical stuff you're really interested in. Share what the podcast has taught you, what has caught your imagination. And, when you're doing that, use the hashtag Scientific Odyssey, all one word. And, if you see a relevant article on a science or history of science topic that's coming from a reputable source, share the link. I'm going to try to do the same thing. Maybe it'll be something cool I'm doing in one of my classes. Maybe it'll be a little history tidbit. Maybe it'll be a new blog post by someone like the friend of the show, Tony Christie at Renaissance Mathematicus. And, if I see a new book or find something in my research I think y'all like, I'll post a link to that as well. I know that you're all busy, and I don't want to lay another burden on you, but I'm hoping that some of you will help me to create a community that reminds us that we're not alone in these intellectual pursuits, in these interests at this wonderful intersection we find ourselves in. Finally, the last question we were asked is, how long would we continue our work? When would we say we've done enough, or that we've been successful enough that we deserve to continue to exist? Well, I'm a firm believer in the everything having a season, and there well may be a time when the scientific odyssey will dock one final time at some port, never again to slip her lines in search of new horizons. I really don't see that time coming soon. There are too many stories still to tell, and too many things I want to learn more about. I'm committed to making time to create a show that's high quality, rich in content and information, and engaging in its storytelling. I don't know if I'll ever be able to get back to that once a week release schedule we once had, but I am going to do better than what I've done here lately. And by the way, knowing that you're out there will really help me. While podcasting, by its very nature, can be a solitary business, it is helpful to be reminded that there are real listeners who you're accountable to. Let me know you're out there, and I'll work hard to give you something to think and talk about. As I wrap up this long overdue update, a couple of shout-outs. First, thanks again to Zachary Taylor and his crew at the Ministry of Ideas for all of their hard work in putting on the first Sound Education Conference. It was a good conversation over the course of 2 days, and I was happy to meet a lot of my colleagues. There are so many excellent independent podcasters out there who are producing top-notch content. We may not always sound as polished as the professionals who work for the big guys like WNYC, WBGH, and Radiolab, but we're every bit as passionate and creative, and I think what independent podcasters offer the listener is truly remarkable. Second, a really big and heartfelt shout out to Ryan Stitt of the History of Ancient Greece podcast, who was my erstwhile roommate for the conference. Very much appreciate, Ryan, you letting me hang around with you and the Classics podcasters. Made the conference a whole lot more enjoyable. Same to the folks at the Agora Podcasting Network who were welcoming and more than willing to engage me in conversation about the art and practice of our obsession. And finally, thanks to you all for sticking around. I'll have a show out about William Whewell in the next 2 weeks as I work to find a schedule where I've carved out time to work on the show, so be looking for that. Until then, full sails on your journey.